What's up, Warriors? In this video, we're going to talk about Chapter 8, which is all about forecasting. So let's get down to it. Lots of things to talk about forecasting. Bottom line up front, first and foremost, what is a forecast anyway? Well, it's kind of like having a crystal ball and looking into the future. Trying to take a guess on what's going on, what's going to happen. Now, there's a number of different forecasts. There's technological forecasts, what's going to happen with technology in the future. There's economic forecasts, what's going to happen with the economy in the future. Pretty important right about now. The forecast we're going to talk about in modern value chain is the demand forecast, meaning specifically, what is the demand for a product or service that we have? What's that demand going to be in the future? When I say demand, I primarily think about how many people are going to buy it, but also we got to think about how much do we need to produce and how much do we need to provide. And I like to say, very simply, that forecasting is everyone's business. Later on, we'll talk about the process in terms of how a forecast is developed and then how a plan is developed. But the bottom line is, regardless who develops the forecast, everyone has to execute a plan based off that forecast. And when I say everyone, I mean everyone throughout the value chain. Marketing needs to develop a forecast, but then also develop a plan on how they're going to address that demand and generate that demand. Operations has to develop a plan on how they're going to produce either that service or that product that we're trying to meet that demand for. And at the same time, what we're going to do about any kind of capacity limitations that we might have that might preclude us from meeting that demand. And of course, throughout the value chain, logistics has to keep it all together. And of course, we can't forget about sourcing. Sourcing has to look at where we're going to get those raw materials we need to sustain the plan that's either going to meet or exceed or potentially not meet the demand, how much we're going to fall short. And of course, it's very obvious that forecasts these days for products and services are very different than what they were 3 to 4 months ago because so much has changed. So the bottom line is, forecasting is everyone's business. Later on, when we talk about sales and operations planning, we'll go into other aspects beyond value chain, such as finance and accounting, as well as executive decision making. But if you get a forecast, you've got to execute it. That's the challenge. The other point that I want to move on to is that the forecast is not the plan. The forecast is what we think will happen. The plan is what we're going to do about that. So for example, let's suppose that we think the forecast for a particular item that we provide is 20,000. But yet, at the same time, we only have the capacity, the stocks, the inventory, the supplies to meet 10,000. Well, we've got to have a plan of how we're going to meet that 10,000. And if we want to get after the 20,000, we have to develop a plan of how we're going to deal with that or how we're going to not deal with that. So how we're going to assume risk, or we're going to make up the difference with doing pre-orders or whatever. So the forecast is not the plan. The forecast is what we will think happen. The plan is how we're going to meet that demand or not meet it and deal with it. Which brings us to another important point. The forecast is, fill in the blank. What would you say to that question? If I said the forecast is always, how would you answer that? Let's think about that. Would you say the forecast is always right? Would you say the forecast is the forecast? Would you say that the forecast is always wrong? That's right. The forecast is always wrong. So you might say, well, why do we bother forecasting in the first place? Because We need to have some idea of what's going to happen so we can develop a plan on how to meet it. But being wrong is not a big deal if we're not wrong by much. So, the name of the game is to have the highest amount of forecast accuracy we can have. Let's take a small example. Let's suppose that we forecast that demand is going to be 20,000. And then it turns out that actual demand, not forecast, but the amount that people buy is 19,500. That isn't that big of a deal. We were only off by 500. We can take that 500 and put it somewhere for the next cycle that we're talking about. Not a big deal. But it is a big deal that if we forecast 20,000 and let's say demand was only 2,000, then we've got 18,000 worth of items that we've got to do something with. Maybe we put them in storage, but that costs money. Maybe we sell them at a discount. We would lose money. See, we have a big problem here. I don't know if it's worse, but another example of this would be if we forecasted for 20,000 and demand was 120,000. Now we have a problem of 100,000 unhappy customers that wanted an item or a service and it wasn't available. So then we've got to go do back orders. We've got to give people discounts. We've got to pay expedited shipping for raw materials. We've got to pay labor for overtime to spin up the production system. And all the while, if we don't do these things, those 100,000 customers will look for our competition and go to our competition for another type of item. They probably won't all wait. Maybe some of them will, especially if we offset things with discounts and things like that. But there's probably a pretty good probability we'll lose a lot of those 100,000. All because our forecast was inaccurate. So, the forecast is always wrong. We can say that. It makes sense. The question isn't the forecast always being wrong. The question is, how much were we wrong? Were we wrong by? And can we recover from it? Another thing to talk about is bullwhip. And bullwhip occurs. We've talked about bullwhip before, but it makes sense to talk about it again. Bullwhip occurs when we have a little bit of downstream inaccuracy in our forecast. And so that results in a change. So all of a sudden, downstream, maybe at a retail location, maybe at some customer agency downstream, even at a wholesaler or distributor, we go from 200 in a week to 2,000. And so bullwhip is often exacerbated by a lack of communication or a lack of awareness, the ability to call down and say, why did you have that jump from 200 to 2,000? Bullwhip happens when everyone reacts to that 2,000, and it just increases up the chain. The distributor changes from 2,000 to 4,000. The manufacturer, instead of producing 2,000, they jump to 6,000, and so on and so forth. And this cascades all the way back upstream. That's what happens with bullwhip. In my opinion, this could be mitigated by a lot better communication. Hey, what's going on? What do we need to do about it? How can we try to dampen the bullwhip? And will we have that same kind of demand next week? Or was this just an anomaly? We talked about ERPs in the past, enterprise resource planning systems, and that is a way that this could be mitigated as well. So let's talk about some principles of forecasting. We already talked about one, which is the forecast is always wrong. Another principle of forecasting is the farther out we go, the less accurate the forecast is going to be. You see this often in weather. The forecast for weather is more accurate tomorrow, But as we go out to 4 or 5 or even 10 days, the forecast becomes less and less accurate. We know that the shorter time horizon we're forecasting for will probably have a higher probability of having a more accurate forecast. Now, sometimes in value chain, industries just don't work that way. So we need, for example, we have things like sports jerseys. We have teams. We need to forecast how many jerseys we need to print for fans for next year, but we don't really know what team is going to do well. So in these cases, what we would do is what I've called postponement, what we call postponement, where we manufacture a certain amount. We kind of make a base amount of each team's jersey, and then we have some generic jerseys that we can save until the last minute and make them particular to the sports team, and therefore meet demand. And finally, another principle of forecasting is that forecasts are actually more accurate in the aggregate. Now, this one is a little bit difficult to get, but once we get into it, it does make sense. So let's talk about shoes. So Nike probably has about 100 different types of shoes, and even within those types, even more and more individual shoes. So when we're trying to forecast an individual type of shoe, the demand for that's actually very, very hard to get that forecast accurate. It would be a lot easier for us to say what is the demand for running shoes, regardless of the actual individual type. And so we aggregate those shoes together and forecast for the aggregate. And in forecasting for the family or the aggregate, our forecast will generally have a higher probability of being more accurate. We can see this in cars, and so we try to group cars together at least into families. Sports cars, minivans, those economy cars into families. Within each one of those family, we might have different models of the sports car, especially when we're talking about Dodge, Ford, Toyota. But it's a lot easier to forecast for the family than for the individual car itself. Let's talk about patterns within forecasting. Any given forecast is made up of really two components. One is some sort of pattern, and then the other is just a degree of randomness. So the name of the game is to try to maximize our understanding of the pattern and therefore decrease forecast accuracy, and to minimize the effect that the randomness has on the accuracy of the forecast. Now, we can do this by identifying three types of patterns and looking for these patterns within the data. The first type of pattern is a trend. So a trend, when we talk about forecasting, is actually very simple. Do we have an upward progression of actual demand? So do we sell 500 one month, 700 another month, 900 the next month? Do we have a downward progression where we sell 900 one month, 700 another month, and then 500 that third month? Or do we have demand just kind of almost stay constant? I call this flatlining. So it stays at 500, give or take a tiny little bit every month. If we see these patterns, this could be known as a trend, and we could forecast with that appropriately. Another type of trend we have is seasonality. Now, when we say the word seasonality, we often think about things that are connected with the four seasons: winter, spring, summer, or fall. All you got to do is call, anyway. Things like Christmas ornaments, sleds, snow blowers for the winter, fireworks, beach balls, barbecue items for the summer, rakes in the fall, and then Easter items and other kind of things in the spring. And these are all examples of seasonality. But seasonality doesn't necessarily happen that way all the time. it could also happen within a time period. So, for example, a barbershop has seasonality within the week. The barbershop encounters a lot of people on Saturday because that's when people generally don't have work, and that's when the barbershop reaches its peak volume of demand. In contrast, a lot of barbershops are closed on Monday because a lot of people are working on Monday, and so they don't come in. So, hence the reason it makes more sense to be closed. So, barbershop experiences seasonality within the week. They don't call it spring, summer, winter, or fall, but we have demand by the day, with the period being the week itself. And finally, we have cycles. So cycles are somewhat kind of a hybrid of trends and seasons. They're over a longer period of time. So things like the housing market and the housing market bursting and the difference between a seller's market and a buyer's market, this happens over a much, much longer period of time. So it's a lot more nuanced and difficult to detect, but cycles are really seasonality at a much larger scale. We talk about some more details of forecasting. Let's talk about how Amazon has really kind of changed the game, and really the internet in total has changed the game when we talk about forecasting. So it used to be that we forecasted for a period of time that was in the future. Or really, we went back and gathered the data that we had, and we kind of went offline to analyze this data. Well, all the while, things were still happening in real time. So the name of the game was to go offline, do that analysis, develop our forecast, and then come back online, hoping that by the time we came back online, things hadn't changed that much. Well, the problem with this is obviously when you go, quote, offline, things are still happening in real time. And if they're changing, then when you come back, your forecast is going to be less relevant and potentially null and void. At the extreme of this, I've seen this in disaster relief and emergency environments where things in demand were changing by the day. So the name of the game becomes, can we forecast in real time? Well, the internet and things called algorithms have really helped us to do this. So a lot of this can be done by blueprinting, which is based on mouse clicks and the internet sites that one visits. The individual advertisements that are generated can be tailored to the individual. This goes back to our discussion on micro marketing. So, for example, if I go to the internet right now and I start scrolling down my Instagram feed, eventually I will find an advertisement for a company that I'm not subscribed to that just populates my feed. And there it is. These folks, I can't even say the name, but they make shoes out of Italy. And it's because I look at a lot of shoe things like that, and not necessarily lately, but I had been. So you see over here on the side, there's this company, Fry, that I was looking at earlier today, and that makes sense. It's a little less nuanced, and there they are, right there in my feed, appearing not only on the side, but in the middle of my feed itself. So not very subtle at all, and that's because these sites, the way that they stay, quote, in business is by selling advertisements. I don't think that's any secret at all. But the point is that if I went and looked at any one of your Facebook feeds or Instagram feeds, yours would look different based on what you've been clicking and viewing lately. Let's look at another aspect of Amazon. So here I've pulled up The Dark Knight Rises, a movie, gives me the option to watch the trailer. And of course down here I've got Customers who watch this also watched. So the whole idea is the algorithms that correspond to The Dark Knight also correspond to these other movies, which is kind of interesting because you go, okay, Batman Forever, Year One, I got it. That looks a lot like the movie you're about to watch. But Interstellar doesn't. All right. Well, they have a common director. Okay. Wonder Woman, that all makes sense. World War Z, that's interesting. What's the relationship there? So it's a lot less obvious, but there's an algorithm, and we call this correlation. A lot of people watch World War Z that would watch The Dark Knight, so it makes sense that I might not like it. I might like it as well. Here's James Bond. Again, a lot less of a obvious relationship between the two. And some other kind of movies. So, action type of movies, comic book heroes, but again, less distinct of a relationship. So, this is called bundling, where and blueprinting, where it's recommended to me, the consumer, another product, even though I came for one. And so, what companies are trying to do with this is be more proactive with their forecasting, get it down to the individual in real time or near real time, rather than these big lags in time between having the data and time passing. You may have heard some people call this big data, and this is actually known as an associative form of forecasting, where a traditional form of forecasting is time series, where I have data, I collect it throughout time, and then essentially I use that data almost like looking at the past to forecast for the future. Associative forecasting, and more importantly, the term big data, I think is going to be more and more prevalent in your time as the internet continues to grow. About it's no longer so necessary to have the full analysis. If I know that two things are happening at the same time, then I don't really necessarily need to understand the relationship between the two. I just know that as one increases, the other one increases. And this is known as associative forecasting, and of course is the name of the game. Before we move on with Amazon, Amazon has even got to the point to where they are telling you what you would want. Hey, Matt, I bet you hadn't thought about these items. We thought you might like them. And so sending you an email, almost kind of getting ahead of rather the looking back on what people have bought, they are trying to turn that around and tell people what they want to buy before the people know they wanted to buy it. And sometimes this works, sometimes it doesn't, but it doesn't have to work all the time. If it works enough times, if you do that with 1 million people and 20,000 go for it, then that's 20,000 who've bought the product. Especially when you're dealing with an online world, you don't necessarily need to produce 20,000 or 100,000. You just have to be able to respond to that demand, which works really well if you're the one generating it and driving it. So it's a much more proactive approach. Before we talk about a couple big things to close with this, let's talk about qualitative and quantitative forecasts. So these are two methods of forecasting. Let's first talk about quantitative forecasts. Quantitative forecasts are all about the numbers, meaning that what have people bought, how much have they bought, when did they buy it? And we call these actual numbers. And so when it's a quantitative forecast, we're using formulas, we're using different methods, whether it be simple methods or more complicated methods to forecast for the future. But they are data driven. And the pro of a quantitative forecast is that we have a formula, we can control variables for that formula, we can adjust that. If we have good data, then we can speak to the data. And so they're very factual, they're very objective. There's not a lot of opinion or emotion involved. If people have bought 5,000 plus or minus 100 every month, then that is what that is, and we can use that to forecast for the future. At the flip side of that, the weaknesses of these forecasts are we are always limited by the strength or the weakness of the data, and we don't have infinite data. It's easier to have data in today's age with the internet and mouse clicks and those kinds of things, but we still don't have all the data. And these formulas can only capture a finite amount of variables. So oftentimes, for example, when we do regression, we compare two items, and we might do multi-variable regression. We might have third involved or something like that, but we can't really capture how people feel and more complex variables. So if we can't measure a variable, then we can't model it and use it in a quantitative forecast, which leads us to qualitative forecasting. Now, qualitative forecasts are what I call kind of fuzzy. They're more subjective. They're more based on how we think people feel. And so Shark Tank to me is a good example of this. You have these people who have really in-depth experience, the sharks in the industry, and they're listening to people pitch what they want to do, and they're thinking about how they think the market is going to react to that based on their experience. All of this is very qualitative, and sometimes it gets kind of ridiculous because you have people who've been in the industry for a long time and say, I have this feeling in my gut, and so I think that the forecast is going to be 50,000. And it's kind of like, where'd you come up with that? And they're like, well, I just know. So again, it's very fuzzy. It's not based on any kind of hardcore, concrete, qualitative formula. It's more of a feeling, both of a feeling of what we think is going to happen, and we think people how they're going to react to things. So the strength of the qualitative forecast is actually the weakness of the quantitative forecast, which is we can get after how we think people are going to feel. It's very subjective. We can try to address issues that can't really be quantified. But at the same time, it has its limitations. It could be biased. It could be incomplete. It's subjective and opinionated in nature. And it's not necessarily very scientific. I don't feel right about 49,000. I feel better about 57,000. Prices on houses are kind of like this. When we sold our house, we started at one number based on really kind of a couple things. So let me just get to this where you might be thinking, well, which type is better? Well, the short answer is it depends, but the longer answer is, in my opinion, really neither method is better. We need a combination of both. So we might develop a quantitative forecast and then bring in more people to look at it and develop it and maybe add on to it a little bit or take away or question and challenge it. So I'll give the example of selling our previous house. We had it priced at a certain value. What we did was kind of a quantitative forecast where we looked at other comparable houses in the area and what they were priced at. And then we added some on to that. So that adding on was kind of a qualitative forecast of what the demand would be for our house and at what people would pay for it. We ended up having to refine that over time and bring that down. But the point of the story is we had to employ, or we did employ, really a combination of that qualitative and quantitative forecast. So I think that doing that is really, you need a combination of the two to really get after not just what has happened, but more what is going to happen in terms of variables that are very difficult to capture. So this next piece, I think, is a very important piece that for everyone, regardless of what you're going to do, sales and operations planning. And it really ties in with my comments at the beginning of this video that forecasting is everyone's business. Regardless of where you're at, if you're in business, you're going to have to execute someone's forecast. And sales and operations planning, you'll see this in job descriptions as a requirement, a knowledge of how the sales and operations planning process works, experience in that area. And I've seen this in my experience. So let's talk about, I'll break it down essentially into about 4 big chunks at the risk of oversimplifying and just kind of you understand. So we have marketing, and marketing traditionally is responsible for developing the forecast. Okay, and they could do this either through a qualitative method, like we just discussed, or a quantitative method. Okay, but they come up with what we think demand is going to be. So let's just say that marketing comes up with demand is going to be 200,000 units for an item. Okay, so very quickly, operations needs to be involved in the forecast, okay, and understanding what the forecast is. And really here we transition from the forecast to the plan. Okay, so operations needs to get the forecast and start developing the plan. Now, what operations is thinking about is, whoa, wait a second, that 200,000, what is our ability to meet and produce and deliver that 200,000? Is our capacity at 250,000? Is it at 100,000? Okay, let's suppose it's at 100,000. So operations says, whoa, wait a second. And here in blue, remember I talked about the difference between forecast and the plan. So at this point, that's why it's called sales and operations planning and not forecasting. It's, whoa, you really think that the forecast is 200,000? We're not going to be able to do that. We're going to be 100,000 short because our capacity today is only 100,000. Well, we might say we'll just increase capacity. You know, get more machines, get more labor, so that this number can meet this number and bring that up. Okay, sounds easy. May not be so. We may not be able to get raw materials in accordance with that requirement. We may not have the skilled labor force. We may not have the machines and the capacity and the other things that we need to meet that. Maybe we could buy that, but money is not unlimited in any company, and marketing wants a piece of that money anyway to do marketing and advertising. So it's not that operations gets all the money. And so very quickly, financial people for the company need to be involved in this dialogue. And so here we kind of have a back and forth, but we also need to have a back and forth here. And really a discussion between all 3 aspects of this, of what the plan is going to be. Are we going to go after that 200,000? If so, do we have capacity shortfall? So this is a feasibility issue. Can we feasibly meet that demand? And this is an affordability issue. Can we afford to meet that demand? Okay, and really it takes these three heads, that's an analogy, although there might be heads of each of these departments, really to come to an agreement on what the plan is going to be. Are we going to go after that 200,000? Are we going to go after 180,000 and assume risk on the remaining 20? Because remember, the forecast is not, it's a guess. We don't know if we think that 200,000 is going to sell, but it might not. We might be wrong. And so we might be way wrong. It might be more than this. So these three components need to agree on what we're going to do towards that forecast. Are we going to overproduce just in case? Okay, can we afford to do so? Is it feasible for us to do so? And then there's a fourth element, which is the executives. So executives run the company, and some of the executives might have involvement in each of these areas. Usually companies have boards, which they're not stuck with the day-to-day, and that frees them up to make decisions. But here's where we get into risk. And so once these three have agreed on a plan, executives have to approve the plan. And usually the plan is, okay, we have this much budget. We're going to spend some of it to increase capacity. We're going to spend some of it to conduct marketing and advertising so that we can go after whatever we think demand is, or we can assume risk. Now, in terms of risk, executives are the ones that carry the risk. That's why they're executives. They make this grand decision here. And so they might be risk-seeking. These are executives that want to, quote, go for it, okay? And they want to make profit. They want to do innovative things. They're okay with risky things. Those are risk-seeking types of decision-making. Then you have risk-neutral, where they're not necessarily aggressive out there, but at the same time, they're okay with some degree of risk as long as we've mitigated it. And then at the other end of the range, we have risk averse. And usually risk averse people are the opposite of risk seeking. They don't like risk at all. They would actually like to go out of their way to not have risk and take even further measures to prevent risk. So let's recap. We start with the forecast. The forecast is not the plan. Marketing traditionally starts the forecast and could use a qualitative method or a quantitative, probably most effectively a combination of the two. Once they've started developing that, they share that with operations. Operations looks at it from a capacity point of view. Can we produce or deliver the amount that is in the forecast? If not, how much are we short? And what would it take for us to not be short in terms of labor, capacity, raw materials, inventory? Usually that equates to some type of either availability. Availability can be offset by money. Money makes the world go around, which is why the financial people for the company have to be brought in pretty quickly for this discussion, because there's only so much money to be spent for the period of time in which the forecast is. So between these three elements, lots of discussion to develop the plan. Again, the plan is not the forecast. The plan is how we're going to address the forecast. Are we going to underproduce and assume risk? Are we going to overproduce in the event that we might be wrong? And in the end of the day, we're always going to carry risk. What is that risk? Overproducing might actually be a risk that we're over and we can't get rid of this stuff without suffering a loss or spending money where we didn't plan on it. So out of all that, they develop a plan, and eventually the executives for the company, and that might be one person, that might be 10, depending on the size of the company, come in to make the decision because they, in the end, have to carry the risk. That's what they get paid to do, is to deal with risk, ask the right questions. And we have three general personalities or approaches among executives: either risk seeking, where they're okay with a lot of risk, or risk averse, where they're not okay with a lot of risk. And so the questions are about mitigating or reducing or eliminating risk. And then we have those in the middle that are okay with some risk but want to know what that risk is before they make the decision. So this talks about sales and operations planning, which is not forecasting alone. Forecasting is an element, but it's more the development of the plan of how the company is going to address the forecast and the elements thereof. So this concludes our discussion, our examination on forecasting. Warrior on.